Hello learners, I'm Jyoti Sehrawat, Assistant Professor, Rawla Singh College of Education, Sidrawali, Haryana. Today, I'm going to deliver my presentation on the topic Classical Conditioning Theory of Learning. So now, let's get started. The classical conditioning theory, which was given by a Russian physiologist, Ivan Pavlov, who was studying the digestive system of animals and accidentally studied the conditioning reflexes on the dogs. Pavlov got his Nobel Prize in the year 1904 in the area of physiology. The term conditioning. It is the process of training of an organism to behave in a certain manner. And conditioning is a form of learning that involves the association of a neutral stimulus with a natural stimulus that leads to a reflexive response. It is also known as Pavlovian conditioning theory, conditioned reflex, conditioned response, respondent conditioning, etc. Now this picture shows the Pavlov's famous experiment with the dog. He put a dog in a cell providing all the basic and necessary requirements and kept a bowl to measure the quantity of the saliva secreted. All activities were monitored through this observational screen and bell was attached to it. Pavlov conducted a series of experiments using different sound-making objects to condition the dog's behavioral response. In his experiment, Pavlov uses a sound of a bell whenever he fed his dog. After several repetitions, the dog started salivating as soon as he heard the sound of the bell, even before it saw the food. Soon after, Pavlov started ringing the bell without giving any food to the dog. Still, Pavlov's dog would continue to salivate at the sound without the sight of the food. That means the sound of a bell had become associated with food, and the salivation response had become a learned response. The sound of the bell became a conditioned stimulus. Now, let's have a look at the terminologies that were being used in the Pavlov's experiment. First, we have unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned stimulus is a natural stimulus that evokes the unconditioned response. For example, in the Pavlov's experiment, food was the natural or unconditioned stimulus. Then we have unconditioned response. Unconditioned response is a natural reaction on a natural stimulus or unconditioned stimulus. For example, in Pavlov's experiment, salivation was a process. For example, in a Pavlov's experiment, the dog started salivating on the presentation of the food. So here, salivation becomes the unconditioned response. Then, conditioned stimulus. Conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that was initially a neutral stimulus, but during the process of conditioning, it is associated with the unconditioned stimulus and become capable of giving the conditioned response. In Pavlov's experiment, ringing a bell was a conditioned stimulus. Then we have conditioned response. Conditioned response is a learned reaction to a conditioned stimulus that occurs because of the process of conditioning. Usually, the conditioned response is as same as the unconditioned response. In Pavlov's experiment, the process of salivation was the conditioned response. Now, let's discuss the stages of classical conditioning. There are 3 steps of classical conditioning, and at each stage, the stimulus and response is identified by different terminology. Let's discuss in detail. First, we have the phase 1, that is before conditioning, or we can say the stage of before acquisition. In this stage, the unconditioned stimulus, that is UCS, produces an unconditioned response UCR in an individual naturally, which is a reflex reaction that doesn't require any training or practice. That is why it is also known as primary reinforcers. In case of Pavlov's experiment, feeding dogs food, that is UCS, unconditioned stimulus, naturally causes them to salivate, that is unconditioned response. This reaction was an unconditioned reflex reaction. In this stage, the neutral stimulus do not trigger any unconditioned response. Neutral stimulus could be anything. It could be any sound, smell, taste, or any object. It does not produce a response until it is paired with unconditioned stimulus. In Pavlov's experiment, ringing a bell, sound of a bell, that was a neutral stimulus which did not give any response of salivation initially in the first stage, that is before conditioning phase. Now let's come to the second stage of classical conditioning, that is during the conditioning process, or we can say acquisition phase. As you can see, in this phase, the neutral stimulus is paired repeatedly with the unconditioned stimulus to form an association. Generally, it takes a pair of stimulus multiple pairings to become associated, but sometimes the association can be formed by single pairing between neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus pairing without any repetition. For example, in Pavlov's experiment, the neutral stimulus, which was a bell, was paired with unconditioned stimulus, that was giving a food. So the bell and food was paired, associated repeatedly, that give rise to unconditioned response of salivation among the dog. Now, in stage 3, which is after conditioning, or we can say after acquisition phase, we observe that the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus can trigger the same response now as the unconditioned stimulus can, even when it is not present. When the involuntary response is triggered by a conditioned stimulus, it is known as conditioned response, which is described as CR. The conditioned response is a learned response. Only the conditioned response and unconditioned response are usually the same or similar. For example, in Pavlov's experiment, after being paired repeatedly with food, the sound of bell, which was initially a neutral stimulus, could cause the dog to salivate by itself. So here the bell becomes conditioned stimulus and now is able to produce the conditioned response of salivation. Now here we don't have to give food to the dogs. Bell itself being able to give rise to conditioned response of salivation among the dogs. So this is the process of classical conditioning. So now let's discuss some educational implications of classical conditioning theory. How teacher can implement the principles of classical conditioning to make their classroom teaching more effective. Well, this conditioning theory is helpful for the habit formation of the children, removal of superstitions, inclusion of the process of reward and punishment while teaching and learning, use of audio-visual aids, arousal of emotions like fear, jealousy, etc. It is very useful in the language learning. Skills like spelling, reading, writing can be taught better with the help of conditioning. This conditioning theory is also very helpful for the younger children. It is helpful for training of the pets at home. This theory also very helpful for the children with learning difficulties and the children with intellectual disabilities. So that is all for today. We will discuss this theory in detail in the next class.